Stephen. Is Stephen on yet?
Hello.
Hey, Lindsay.
Yes.
You want to rattle Stephen's? Is he on? I don't see him.
No.
I'll text him.
Okay, yeah.
Yes. Oh, sorry. I didn't notice you were gone. Okay. Well, we're still waiting for Stephen. But if you're not, I'm sorry. All right. Well, do you want me to just kick it off when Stephen gets on? So Jim Noel just got kicked out and he can't get back on.
Yeah, Steven said he was having an issue and I just resent him the link.
Okay. All right. We'll wait a minute or two for Stephen. Once Stephen gets on, we'll kick it off.
He's on now. I think he might show up under my name.
Yeah, I got him.
Yeah, I can change it.
Lindsay, your hair looks completely different today.
It's gonna ruin your good name, Lindsay.
Hey, Jason. All right, everybody. Jim Noel just called me and he's gotten kicked off Zoom and can't get back in. So he's going to continue to try, but in the essence of time and we'll go ahead and get started. Stephen's going to kick us off today, and then Matt Weaver is going to talk a little bit about CDBG. I have to say that very slowly to get it right. And then Sarah is going to talk to us about Go Virginia. So Stephen, you want to kick us off? And do you want to share your screen? Are you ready for your slides? Or
yes, I will. I will in just a moment. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're staying safe and that you had at least a somewhat relaxing weekend. Today, I'm mostly going to talk about economic impact analysis. For the first time, we have some slides that we would like to share with you, and we'll try to make those available, not immediately because we're still making some tweaks, but hopefully in the next 24 hours or so, we'll have a shareable version that Connie can put up on the VEDA site. Before I jump into that, just a couple quick updates on personal protective equipment, PPE. We continue efforts there. I think we've got a very organized state effort now, and VEDP's main role at this point through our BI team is reaching out to, I'm forgetting the number, but somewhere between 700 and 1,000 companies that are in priority tiers. A lot of outreach last week, a lot more outreach this week, working on that topic. On the state budget situation, I think it's still going to be some time, possibly a few weeks before we have a better picture of what revenues are going to look like for this year or the current year, but certainly continue to be concerned. I saw there was a Wall Street Journal editorial on Saturday that actually was pressuring the Trump administration not to provide additional support to states, under the thinking that if additional federal support was provided, the states might take longer to reopen. So that's a really bad sign, because if we don't get some additional federal support for the state budgets, it's highly likely that there'll be pretty severe negative impacts on the budget. And this morning, the latest stories out suggested that states were not going to be included in the next round. States and localities, I should say, were not going to be included in the next round of federal support. That would include PPP extension, which is, of course, very much needed, as well as support for hospitals and testing, but potentially not for states and localities. So let me bring up, let's see. I'm going to bring up my screen here. Let's see. Try that again. There we go. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so I want to just mention before I dive into this that we've had some great work that's been done by our research team in particular, as well as our economic competitiveness team, and we've benefited from a lot of data and insights that we've received from many of you, as well as many of our other state agency partners. On this slide, you'll just see some examples of those groups that across the Commonwealth at the state level that have contributed data and or suggestions to this effort. But please want to emphasize that any errors are certainly VEDP zones. So I just wanted to recognize these folks for contributing, but ultimately we take ownership for what we're sharing today. The other thing is, as I dive into this, just to emphasize that these numbers are very preliminary. They're very likely to change. But we are going to be able to let you see what we've done so far. So first of all, looking at GDP, we share here a number of analyses from Moody's, Wells Fargo, IHS Markit, and the Wall Street Journal consensus forecast from economists. In general, an expectation of a very large GDP decline in the second quarter. The employment impacts will likely be in a roughly similar range, with most folks expecting recovery starting in the third quarter. As you may note there, if you look at the Moody's forecast for the U.S., the blue dotted line compared to the Moody's forecast for Virginia, the blue solid line there on the top in the second quarter. As we suggested a couple weeks back when we first started talking about all this, it does appear that Virginia is going to fare better than the country overall, both because of the large presence of the federal government in our economy, as well as the large percentage of jobs compared to other states, at least, that can be performed remotely, in particular because we have a larger share of our economy that's in professional positions. Moving forward, obviously, we've seen a skyrocketing level of initial unemployment claims, more than 415,000 filed since the beginning of March. We did see that go down a bit in the last week, but I would expect to continue to see significant additional claims coming over the next few weeks as businesses continue to deal with the challenges that have been brought forth here. Certainly the PPP loans and other supports are going to help, but many companies are unable to get those, and even many of those that do get them are not able to keep all of their staff on board. On the right-hand side, this is just a very preliminary look looking at February to March change in U.S. employment. You can see their leisure and hospitality representing the lion's share of job losses so far. As you look at the initial unemployment claims as a percentage of baseline jobs, there is a significant variation across the state. You could see, for example, the Middle Peninsula there at 13.4%. That's initial unemployment claims divided by the jobs before the drop began. So 13.4% in the Middle Peninsula versus 6.9%, for example, for the Eastern Shore. So quite a range there. Two biggest reasons we've talked about previously. One is the presence of a large percentage of jobs in the most heavily impacted sectors like hospitality. Additionally, in some regions, we've had layoffs of a large employer or two, let's say in the manufacturing sector, that have had a disproportionate impact. Really appreciate VEC's work here. They were able to give us the occupational mix of the layoffs, the unemployment claims, which largely represents layoffs that have occurred since from March 4th to April 11th. I think this is the latest available data, with more coming out in the next few days. Keep in mind, this is occupation, not industry sector. We don't yet have the industry sector mix, although they're trying to track that down. But this does give you a sense of where some of the biggest impacts are. That's total unemployment claims in Virginia. The bars on the left-hand side, food prep and serving, office and administrative support, personal care and services, the top three. And then on the right-hand side, you can see average wages based on BLS data in 2019. And what I would point out there is, if you look at the temporary unemployment supplement of $600 per week, that would be the equivalent of $30,000 per year. So most folks on unemployment will get that additional $600 per week plus whatever their normal unemployment benefit is. So when you look at these averages, any average that's below $35,000 a year or so, those folks should be made pretty much whole or better than whole, at least during the period that they're getting their unemployment benefits. This slide really represents where the bulk of our analytical effort has gone, and that is trying to understand what the potential job losses are by industry sector. And this is not so much right now, but where we think it could bottom out roughly by late May or June. We're anticipating roughly 590 to 970,000 jobs lost, including direct, indirect, and induced effects. By the bottom, if you will, which we think would occur slightly after the apex from an epidemiological perspective. This analysis was informed by our own analysis, by looking at some of the third-party analyses that have been done by McKinsey and Moody's and others, by interviews with trade associations, just a wide variety of things. But you may recall from the first conversation we had about this a while back, we talked about there being kind of three big sectors: severe, moderate, and minor. And initially, the minor we thought was going to be close to half, but that's now looking like a smaller percentage at 34%. So it's roughly a third across those three categories. Clearly, hospitality and entertainment, the biggest in terms of percentage losses. That's that middle set of bars. And then on the right-hand side is the approximate number of actual job losses by sector. So as you think about that, because the sectors themselves are vary quite a bit in their size, the total job impact is a function of both the percentage of jobs that are lost as well as just the size of that sector itself. But in general, this is consistent broadly with what we originally expected. I would say the one significant difference that's probably notable from our original analysis that started maybe a month ago is that healthcare is facing more job losses than we originally anticipated because of the combination of cutting the elective surgeries, but also as those elective procedures have been cut, it's had a tremendous impact on revenues because for many hospitals, that's where they're getting the bulk of their profits to offset losses in other areas. So we're seeing our healthcare sector under a tremendous amount of pressure. We have seen some layoffs. We expect those to continue. But this is the best look we have right now. I am anticipating when we do the next update on this slide that both manufacturing and healthcare are going to look a little bit worse than what we show on this slide. If you just sort of think about it in terms of the total losses on this chart here, this is the same numbers from the previous slide in terms of the total losses by sector, just to give you a sense of roughly the size. So hospitality and entertainment, clearly the biggest, and really those severely impacted sectors represent about 75% of the anticipated job losses in the Commonwealth. These are the numbers here in thousands of jobs. Looking at some of the subsectors, hold on, I think we got a question here. Let's see. Shelpo asked, are there projections associated with these data that address job creation after this time period, i.e. what will come back quickly, et cetera? Great question. Really, really good question. We've not done that work yet, and it really depends to a very large degree on the nature of how the reopening process is handled, what the social distancing measures put in place are, as well as critically what level of federal relief and stimulus is provided. So I do think we're going to do some work on that question, but it's probably going to be a little while, and it will be a very big range of possible outcomes. You could imagine, best case scenario is a full recovery sometime in 2021. Worst case could be 4 to 5 years. So it's really quite a big range, and there's a lot of different factors that will impact the pace. On this slide, just showing some of the more heavily impacted subsectors. So the previous slides were comprehensive, looking at all the big sectors. I think at the 2 or 3 digit level, this is looking a little bit deeper in terms of the more heavily impacted subsectors. A few other just notable impacts in some of the smaller subsectors. Aquaculture and seafood really hit overall. Food in general, ag in general has done okay, semi-okay, but aquaculture has really taken a big hit, largely because of shifts in the supply chain. You see a lot of families not purchasing as much seafood. It's considered a little bit more of a luxury good, but also because so much of that was normally going through the restaurant channel, which is obviously heavily down. Automotive manufacturing heavily hit, tire manufacturing heavily hit, newspapers, movie production basically shut down. Commercial banking is a little bit more of a mix, but certainly seeing some layoffs and branches and so forth. Mining, most of the major coal mines in Virginia, in fact, roughly all the major coal mines are shut down temporarily. Nonprofits are struggling because you're seeing a lot of challenge with donations and so forth. Federal, state, and local governments, this is actually a big open question that will depend in large. Federal government, I don't expect to have material layoffs, but state and local government's really going to depend to a large extent on both the pace of recovery as well as any additional federal support. And I think we got a couple more questions here. Let's see. Liz Favar says we appreciate some good news in this presentation. Well, we may have some. And thanks for the Yokohama note, John. Sorry about that. Let's see. Okay. And then there is some good news here, Liz. There are a number of areas that are experiencing growth. In general, this big shift to online delivery, as well as away from restaurants. You've got significant growth in grocery stores and online retailers. Anything related to sort of cleaning supplies and so forth. Our data centers are doing very well. Quick serve restaurants are down, but not down nearly as much as the much less down than the dine-in restaurants. And then there's some other areas like food processing in general is doing really well. In fact, many of those companies are running full tilt, like in the Shenandoah Valley area, for example. So this is kind of, you put all that together and look at what the potential job losses could look like for each region. So overall, the average of our range would be roughly 17%. And then if you look from the low to high percentage of losses compared to baseline, that's what you see on this chart. So, I think the extreme end was Greater Williamsburg, 18.4 to 29.3%. At the bottom, if you will, of losses in the May-June timeframe. Some areas impacted, somewhat less than that. In particular, I think it was the Gateway region is expected to be the smallest at 10.9 to 18.2%. So certainly a wide range. These ranges certainly will change, but this is our best estimate right now after several weeks of effort looking at this. I feel reasonably confident that we're going to get somewhere in these ranges rather, for most of these regions. Just a little bit about how these analyses compare to some of the other groups that are out there. I would say in general, our approach is more comprehensive than some. So we are looking at all sectors, not just non-farm payroll. So we're including sole proprietors, we're including government, including ag. So it's a comprehensive picture. That's one of the reasons why our job loss estimates are somewhat higher than Moody's. That's just looking at non-farm, but we also are a little bit more pessimistic overall than the Moody's forecast. McKinsey's done an analysis that was also really well done that looks not just at job losses, but also reductions in hours and wages. They've indicated in their Virginia analysis, they expect roughly up to 1.3 million of jobs are vulnerable to either job loss or an hour wage reduction. We haven't looked at as much at the reduction in hours or wages, but that is a key factor as well. Weldon Cooper Center has done some analysis on non-farm losses, and they've estimated roughly that we would be down 300 to 500,000 by the end of the calendar year. But that incorporates, that's not representative of the bottom. It's representative, where we would end up at the end of the year. And they're continuing to do some good work, working with VEDP. We'll be able to share more of that going forward. Looking just a little bit about how these impacts play out by firm size, as I think just about everybody on the call knows, the vast majority of our firms are small firms, as you can see there in the top left as well as bottom left. And when you look at it from an employment perspective, while the vast majority of firms are small firms, employment is closer to a 50-50 mix between larger employers and smaller employers in terms of total employment. But what I thought was fairly insightful is if you look at on the right-hand side there, the blue here represents total employment of firms that have less than 500 workers versus gray more than 500. And so you can see there are some sectors that are really dominated by smaller firms that are going to tend to be a little bit more sensitive to the downturn. So ag, construction, arts and entertainment, and so forth. Whereas some of the bigger entities like corporate headquarters, utilities, finance and insurance tend to be larger, likely to be somewhat less impacted. Also, as you think about where those size of businesses show up in the impact sectors, in general, the lower impacts are likely to be more in the larger business categories versus the more severe impacts likely to be more based in the smaller firms. Not dramatically different, but different. So as we start to think about the recovery, and this starts to get at, I think, Michelle's question earlier, our team has looked back at the Great Recession to try to start to get some clues about what recovery could look like. If you look at this chart here, the big companies are the ones that are in gray here. So in general, you saw them recover their employment faster there than the smaller firms did on the left-hand side. And that is something that we think is probably likely to occur again. Additionally, when you look at where the losses are, kind of consistent with this earlier analysis, that while the mix of jobs is roughly 50-50 between big companies and small companies, most of the losses in the Great Recession, roughly 73%, were in those smaller firms. And I think something kind of like that mix is what we'd anticipate again here. Additionally, when you look at closures, nearly all the closures were in the smaller firms in the Great Recession. Not a big surprise, of course, because the vast majority of firms are smaller firms, but that is the kind of picture we think we're going to see here in Virginia as well. Looking at the PPP, this is not the final numbers. I think this is roughly 2/3 of the way through. In general, Virginia did better than some of the other bigger states that we compete with. When you look at millions in loans approved as a percentage of private sector GSP or as a fraction of payroll, in general, we did pretty well compared to most of these other states. Second to last slide here. The other thing we wanted to look at is how those loans that were made, again, this is I think roughly 2/3 through, how they varied by industry sector based on severity. So you can see it is somewhat connected, but certainly one of the things that we've seen and that we forecasted, as you may recall, on our VEDA call, I think a couple of weeks ago, we were fearful that a lot of firms that were really not that heavily impacted would apply for loans just in case, crowding out others that had more severe impacts. And this certainly suggests that some of that did happen. Let's see, there's a question that came in. Oh yeah, Stephen Hark on our research team says we just got final numbers, but we are still beating North Carolina, so that's good. Betty Mitchell asks, what comprises other services? Let me see on which slide here. Get back. Actually, let me go back to that when I finish this last slide, Betty, if you don't mind. So last slide I was going to share, this is not our analysis, but it is, I thought something that might be useful to share. McKinsey did this is not Virginia, this is for the US, but it's likely to be a similar directional picture in Virginia. They did a consumer sentiment survey that ran April 6th, April 12th, so pretty recent. And by the way, it's a really terrific survey. If you look it up online, it is available publicly. This is just one slide. I think there's maybe 20 slides in their deck. If you just search for McKinsey U.S. Consumer Sentiment Survey, I think it'll pop up in Google. But what you can see here, the black bars represent the percentage of people that said that their expenditures in the next 2 weeks would be less than what they normally would do. Blue was more, gray was about the same. So you can see in general, as you think about recession and economic downturn, these are not how much less they plan to spend, but certainly an expectation that in many, many categories, people are spending less or planning to spend less than they normally do. And certainly that's going to put more pressure on a whole range of categories, even those that were not directly impacted by various public policies. Let's see. Chris Morello says, does your raw data allow you to produce similar graphs for other small business size subsets? For example, 5 to 15, 15 to 50, et cetera. Stephen Hartka, can you answer that question?
Yep. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yep.
The firm size data, which we think is a little better to look at than the establishment data, it has less granular employment ranges. I think the smallest one is 0 to 19. So it doesn't, because the micro businesses are really a lot of those job losses. So it doesn't let you separate out 0 to 4, 5 to 10, and 10 to 19, unfortunately. So that is a limitation there.
Well, thank you. Let's see. Anthony Romanella says, is locality-specific information for PPP loans available? Do you know that as well, Stephen?
Not yet. We hopefully soon. We've just been looking at the press releases they've been putting out.
Thank you. We'll certainly do that, Anthony, if we get the data, but right now we don't have it. Liz Povar asks if our data can be produced by RDO region. A bunch of these can be. I know we've got a call with regional economic development groups tomorrow. If folks feel like that's something that they would really want, we can look at updating, creating kind of regional specific cuts. The one question just is how we've still got a lot of analysis we need to do on the big picture. So I'll have to follow up the research team to just get a sense of how difficult it would be by a chart, and we can provide an update on that. Let's see. So that was the Jim and Connie. That was the last slide that I was planning to share. Certainly open to questions. I do have some other slides in the appendix that I didn't plan to go through, but if there are particular questions, happy to touch on those. Let me do though. Wanted to go back to the question from, let's see, Betty Mitchell on what comprises other services. Let's see here. Stephen, you want to answer that one? It may vary by slide, I suspect.
Yes. So it includes repair and maintenance, personal and laundry services. So that includes beauty salons and barbershops, notably, which have been really heavily hit. Grant making and religious organizations. I'm just reading off the NAICS codes. We don't have it at that level of detail.
I'm just trying to see where it showed up in the deck. I'm not sure exactly where what Betty's question was referring to. Okay, we may have to follow up on that one offline. There were a few other comments here. Let's see. Other folks would like that regional analysis. Let's see. And then the question is, can it be broken down by locality? Now, one thing to keep in mind is the more we subdivide the state down to subsectors, the less accurate it's going to be. So in general, what I would suggest at the locality level, because what we've done, if you look at this, let me go back. When you look at this slide that shows kind of the estimated range of job loss by region, and Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think essentially what we've done is just to take the industry sector mix of employment in each region and apply the same estimated reductions in employment by sector pretty much across the board. Is that fair, Stephen?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, so it was the best kind of we had available to do that in a relatively quick way. If you get down to the locality level, it's almost certain to be too clunky of a way of doing it because a single significant layoff in one sector would really throw it off. But I think at the regional level, it probably balances out okay. The other thing I would say is if anyone, if you wanted to get a sense of that impact, at a high level, you could simply take the employment in your locality across each of these, major industry sectors shown here. And if you apply the same, percentage estimates to that, that would be a rough estimate. But again, at the locality level, I think folks are going to have more, I would expect in many cases are going to know more about what's actually going on in each of these industry sectors than we would, looking at it for the whole Commonwealth. We were trying to sort of create a big picture perspective here. But what I will commit to do between now and our next call a week from now is figure out what we can provide at a more granular level at the regional and or local levels, and see if we can follow up on that. The one thing in managing expectations, I do want to be clear that we do have a bunch of additional analyses that we need to do that will be helpful, that we have to prioritize over, if it takes a lot of time to do stuff at the locality or regional level. But we'll do the best we can, and we'll have an update for you guys for next week, if not before. Let's see. Can also be broken down per locality. Go Virginia regions. I'm sure that we can do that. Let's see, regional. Yes. Megan, I'm not sure exactly what you're saying, but you say ED region would be best as we are defined as a regional economy. One of the things we did, I should point out, is these regions that we've shown are what we consider to be marketing regions. So they are loosely tied to the regional EDO definitions, but they're not the same because we tried to, we wanted to create a view that captured all the localities in Virginia, not just those that are part of a regional EDO. So if you imagine where each locality that's not in a regional EDO would most likely be if they were to be connected to one, that's how we created that view. Keith asks, any indication why the gateway region is going to be better off in relation to job loss? Keith, at a high level, I don't have the data in front of me other than what's in the slides, but it basically means that you would have a smaller percentage of your total employment in those severe impact sectors. Anthony Romanello asked about, can we please review how announcements are being handled now? Basically, we're still in the same posture as last week. So the administration is saying we don't want to do anything to proactively announce projects. Basically, what we would do is if a company is ready to commit, they would go ahead and do the normal documentation of that, the letter of intent and so forth. And we would, count that as a win. They could move forward with hiring and so forth. With the intent that we would all coordinate together, later on, sometime down the road on a public announcement. If the company and or locality feel that it's important to proceed, earlier than that, they're being asked not to, but there'll be no penalty if they want to go ahead and announce on their own. We just ask that the administration is asking that information be shared ahead of time so they'll know that it's coming. But I think in general, there's just a hesitation for the administration to be making announcements right now, but they don't want to do anything that would hold up companies proceeding with their with their expansions. So we should no longer have there's no longer at least any intent for anything to be in a postponed scenario at this point. Let's see, Lindsay. I'm sorry, prior question. Let's see. Let's see. Other folks were sending me questions separately that are not in the tracker, but I'll just read these out. So one person says, with each state deciding when and how to open up their economies, what impact will that have on our competitiveness in the short term if we open later than Texas, Tennessee, et cetera? I think it really depends on what the status is in each state of the epidemiological situation, as well as the availability of testing and contact tracing. So if a state opens earlier, but then has to close because they weren't really ready later, then they didn't really gain, an advantage from doing so. So there's a whole set of activities that have to come in play to be ready to reopen. I'm just going to share with you, I'm not going to dwell on this, but I was in a briefing on Friday with McKinsey they've been working with states and governments around the world, including governments in Europe and Asia that are reopening, much earlier than us. And just, I'm not going to go through these in detail, but there's a whole series of things that really have to be ready. We've got to have health system capacity, including PPE and hospital beds that are ready in case there's a second wave, if you will. We've got to have more broad spread testing. There has to be contact tracing. We have to protect vulnerable populations. And then there's a whole series of things around guidelines and or requirements for how businesses should operate that are currently not allowed to operate. Well, that's not all of it, but those are some of the big things that really need to be addressed. Otherwise, if a state reopens without having its act together on those different factors, they could end up having kind of a false start that actually puts them in a worse position. Another question came in was, are there opportunities for localities to make PPE purchases from those firms in Virginia that are manufacturing PPE? Certainly from the state's perspective, I think it's fair to say our top priorities are our healthcare providers and our first responders. And VDM, I think, is coordinating, how the various PPE that's gathered is being shared across the Commonwealth. Certainly, folks could reach out as they may desire to individual producers, but I think from a state perspective, those two populations are going to be the top priorities for now. And I see Keith Boswell says 78% of restaurant workers laid off since March. If we go back, I think that was still within our forecast range. Yeah, so if you look at our, look at our range here, we envisioned roughly somewhere between about 55% and about 90% or so. So that's right in that range. So Connie or Jim, those were the things that I thought would be useful for folks to see at this point.
Thank you, Stephen.
Questions or comments?
Much appreciated. Are you able to stay on if there's questions after our other speakers?
Yes, I will.
And I had one question, since such a huge impact on the restaurant industry and the hospitality industry, is there going to be some information we can pass on to people in food service about what steps they will have to take when we're prepared to reopen? And in other words, to get them prepared ahead of time, to have procedures or equipment in place where they can be doing training or something ahead of the game so that they can open as quickly as possible, some standard process procedures the state can provide early?
That's a great question. And there is, in fact, a group of people at the state level that is working on that exact question right now, which is really around guidelines for reopening businesses that have been required to close or required to change the nature of their operation.
Right, because we're getting that request right now.
Yeah.
All right.
And the plan is to get that out, well before, when the reopening would occur. I don't have the exact timeline, but I knew they're working on it actively as we speak.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for being here today. Really appreciate it. Next up, we have Matt Weaver from Housing and Community Development with some information, I think, about the Community Development Block Grant Program. Matt?
Yeah, great, Jim. Can you hear me?
I can.
Awesome. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Matt Weaver with the Department of Housing and Community Development. And so just want to take just a couple minutes to walk through some of the ways that DHCD is trying to utilize some of our Community Development Block Grant CDBG funds. And so the infographic in front of you, and Connie, you can scroll down just to those numbers, eligible activities would be kind of the main impetus of this. All this information is on the DHCD website, and we can go into some other details if you want. I just wanted to focus real quickly that the infographic in front of you describes how DHCD is using our current FY20 CDBG funds to try to address some of the responses that localities are taking to flatten the curve and also to protect some of their citizens. And so we've made $6.5 million available from our FY20 allocation. This is currently only available to non-entitlement communities, so most of the rural areas and smaller cities that do not receive their own HUD funding through CDBG program. And so we're shifting a lot of what we traditionally have used CDBG funds from infrastructure-oriented projects to some public service-oriented. And so the 4 bullets in front of you kind of just vaguely and kind of broadly address some of the areas we've tried to really pivot to. And as Stephen mentioned, some of the kind of bigger priority areas are toward healthcare and actually protecting some of those workers or the creation of products to protect workers. So, we're working a lot with communities, particularly with homeless populations and the rapid rehousing movement to create isolation facilities or testing facilities, not only to address the general public, but those that don't have a safe place to isolate, making sure that those frontline workers that haven't the ability to go home and isolate from their families have a place they could go and be isolated if they're exposed or feel like they're exposed. So working on those facilities, as well as we've got a couple of the VEDA partners working on some manufacturing facilities that are repurposing some of their equipment, personnel, or they're ramping up operations of the personal protective equipment. And so we are trying to work with localities or businesses to create that PPE that's drastically needed. And so a lot of that effort is trying to figure out how we use CDBG to scale up the equipment purchases or making that available to some of the local, regional, and statewide efforts to create that PPE supply chain. We've trying to look at how we can actually utilize a job retention program through the CDBG funds. And that whole presentation, a lot of the data that Stephen just shared I'm hoping that we can use that at DHCD to help drive this program and work with you all to engage what job retention would look like through CDBG. And so that would be an effort that we're going to have to really shape. We don't have a current job retention path. And we're looking at how we could engage some of the areas that were mentioned, the tourism industry, specifically, the Williamsburg, York County area, Bath County, we've heard an interest from with the homestead, downsizing. And so looking at a lot of the locations that have built have a major industry in tourism or that kind of service sector. So how can we address some of that through CDBG is what we're trying to look at. If you have thoughts, I'd love to hear some of what you're doing, but we've seen some of the analysis and we hope to use some of the data to help drive what a grant could look like or how we would work with some of those local businesses to retain the employees or keep the doors open so that we're sustaining some businesses as opposed to getting toward when the state's reopening and we're trying to reopen all these businesses. Hopefully it's a little easier to sustain the businesses at a lesser level than have to reopen them. But we haven't quite fleshed out exactly how that will roll out. And with this current funding, we're trying to use this $6.5 million almost as a test, if you will, a pilot for our current $11 million allocation of CARES Act funds that is to be coming, since we don't know exactly when that will be made available from HUD in the coming weeks. We're trying to use these current CDBG funds as a way to kind of test out some of our localities' needs and how we address them so that then we can look at a larger level to look at using the CARES Act funds. With this group, I want to make it kind of clear. We're trying to ask HUD currently for some waivers so that we can work in some of the entitlement areas with the CARES Act funds. If we can partner with our larger communities to increase the service area or really address the needs across the entitlement boundaries, we're asking for some allowances there, as well as to work with our regional entities, PDCs, maybe even the regional EDOs, and kind of looking at how we can truly provide some larger scale efforts across, jurisdictional boundaries. So we understand a lot of these needs don't follow, jurisdictional boundaries. And if we can kind of address that at a larger level, we may be able to, more quickly address some of the needs. So that's really super vague, super kind of quick. We're really trying to learn as we go and pivot to what we have heard the needs are. We've heard some really creative ideas as far as working with local food banks or working with a couple of the hotels to engage some of their restaurant staff to then serve some of the local unemployed restaurant workers, to creating a pop-up food bank so that those unemployed are not then overwhelming other food bank resources in the area. We've heard some good avenues about some of the local meals programs When you have a kitchen that's creating, 500 meals for families across a locality, if someone tests positive in that kitchen, they have to shut down for at least 2 weeks to maintain, isolation and protection for their employees. Well, then what happens to that meals program? So trying to figure out if CDBG could be a fit to then partner with local businesses to kind of have them fulfill the contractual food obligation to those families. So trying to think creatively and bringing in some ways to serve businesses locally, but then kind of address a lot of the response to the COVID-19 that's happening all across the state. So with that, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer now or kind of offline, since currently our allocation only serves a portion of the VEDA population on the call, but we're happy to kind of think through local needs and then see if CDBG might be a resource. So there is one question of what are the size of the grants for manufacturing for PPE job creation? So currently we're looking at the need of the program as opposed to a total max. We only have 6.5 million, but we haven't capped it. So if there's particular equipment that's needed, if there are additional staff that are needed, we could look at trying to scale a grant toward the kind of either shift to creating PPE or the expansion of efforts. We're working with one locality to buy some new equipment that will enable them to ramp up their processes to make parts for ventilators. And so it would be on a case-by-case basis, but usually it's 10,000 per job if it's an expansion, or if it's the purchase of unique equipment, we can help purchase that and then secure that through the EDA or the locality.
Great, thank you, Matt. Any more questions for Matt?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And if you have
All
any,
right.
Please feel free to get in touch.
Okay. Are you able to hang on until we finish, Matt, or you got to?
Nope, absolutely. I can stick around.
Great. Okay. Well, we're now going to go to Sarah Dunnigan with Housing and Community Development for a Go Virginia update. Sarah?
Hey, thanks, everybody. Connie's going to work with me remotely, and she's going to advance the slides. So you guys will have to just forgive us. We haven't had much time to practice this. Go ahead, Connie. You guys really understand what Go Virginia is, but last Friday, the state Go Virginia board created a new program that I'm going to tell you about today. This is definitely early release information. We haven't even developed the final guidelines for this program, but I wanted to share with you what was in the board's policy in the creation and also included in a white paper, which kind of accompanied the board's decision. You guys are all familiar with Go Virginia. The concept here is regionally driven economic development initiatives looking for collaboration between local governments, higher education, private industry, looking to incentivize projects that will create higher paying jobs. I'm going to come back to this, primarily in traded sectors. I'm going to come back to this. And we, with this new program, want to stay really true to that mission, but expand the program scope. Next slide. Here are the Go Virginia regions, just to give you a sense of, you should all kind of know where you are on the map. Connie, go ahead. High level, Go Virginia grants are structured in 3 ways. There's 3 pots of funds. Okay, one is a capacity building grant that goes to your regional support organizations, and that is to administer the program and work on project development. There is staff in your regions that is working on these angles. Per capita, which is funding allocated based on the region's population. Those funds are in place. And the third pot is a statewide competitive pot. Now, traditionally, these funds have been reserved for projects that involve 2 or more regions or projects that have the potential for significant statewide impact. And these are the funds, the statewide competitive funds from fiscal year 20 that the board is electing to pivot towards this new Economic Resilience and Recovery Grant Program. Next slide. This just gives you a sense of scale, and you can see in that middle section, if you're curious about what your region's allocation is on the per capita side, a reminder, those funds are still in place. So this new grant type, again, would redeploy the $14.66 million on projects related to resilience and recovery in the 9 Go Virginia regions. Next slide. Here are the basics. Each region will be able to apply for up to $1 million for projects that directly respond to the COVID-19 crisis. Now, folks have asked me what is directly. We're trying to keep the aperture as wide open as possible. One thing that's really foundational to Go Virginia is the belief that regions understand better than Richmond what their unique assets are, what their needs are, the community of partners that they have ready to work and execute these projects. So we do expect that our application, which is going to look very familiar, is going to have a single question: please describe how this project will help to mitigate the economic impact of the COVID-19 health crisis. Each region will have a year to access these funds. That decision can be extended by the board. If those resources are not used and the program is not extended, those funds will revert to the statewide competitive pot. So per capita funds are non-reverting, meaning those balances can accumulate year over year. Go Virginia is that type of a program, but these funds will be time limited and specific. The guidance that we're prepared to issue is going to encourage a continued focus on the traded sectors. Each Go Virginia Regional Council has developed a growth and diversification plan, but this grant type is going to allow for some flexibility for locally traded sectors to be supported as identified by the regional councils. And that process is going to be determined at the regional level. We do not want to be overly prescriptive. We do ask everybody to remember there's $1 million for these activities, and really a focus on the highest value activities to get the largest return, I think, is important. The remainder, $5.66 million, is going to be reserved for projects with statewide impact. And we are already receiving some concept papers from entities that have an idea for a statewide project. These are sector-based strategies, and the early interests that we've seen just over the past couple of weeks. And again, we introduced this as a concept to the regional councils a few weeks ago. Chairman Farrell, Tom Farrell, who's the chair of the Go Virginia board, certainly sent some communication to the councils, encouraging them to start thinking about these types of projects and initiatives. And this funding in place is really, it's a good timing. One thing that we heard was we need to move fast, and we know we need to move fast. There's some immediacy to the work here. And to accommodate that, each region can access up to $300,000 of their $1 million, I'm going to call it an allocation, using what we call a fast access application process. So we've already heard from the regions, various stakeholders, that there are some small to mid-sized projects that in the near term could be very impactful and build a foundation for much larger activities and initiatives. DHCD already has the authority given to it by the State Go Virginia Board to administratively approve projects. We've traditionally only done that quarterly. We're going to go to an open application process, review those, and as long as they meet the program guidelines, administratively approve them and go directly to contract so that we can get those resources out in the field. Larger requests, larger than $100,000, which again is the maximum authority DHCD has to administratively approve projects. Those will need to go to the Go Virginia State Board. May 22nd is our next application deadline. June 23rd is our next scheduled board meeting, and we would expect for larger requests to have them reviewing applications at that time. Another thing that's significant about the Economic Resilience and Recovery Grant Program is a relaxed match. So Go Virginia out of the gate was really looking at a one-to-one match. The board has the authority to reduce those match requirements. So what that means is for every dollar that's able to be organized at the regional level, we will invest $2 in those activities. Just a reminder for folks, the match has to be from a non-state source. Now, disclaimer, on July 1, we believe we're going to have the flexibility to allow one other state resource to apply as match, and that's Tobacco Commission funding. So if you're in one of those tobacco region, if you're in the tobacco region, more coming on that. And the other thing about this particular program is there's no local match requirement. So Go Virginia, again, built on this kind of idea of regional collaboration, local government participation has always required for most of its funding, local match from a locality or another public entity. For this particular program, recognizing localities are facing significant fiscal distress, those requirements will be waived. Next slide. There's going to be some things that are going to be the same. I've told you a lot about things that are going to be different. These are still going to be used, these resources, to support regional activities. 2 or more participating localities, and while we're not asking for financial participation, we will be looking for a strong commitment from localities in the form of letters of endorsement. If they're pass-through entities for other sources of funding that would be non-state, for example, even though the local match isn't required, it could certainly come, okay, if local governments have something they want to do and see the opportunity to really expand that program's impact using Go Virginia funds. We're looking for actionable sector-based strategies, again, to mitigate the impact of this crisis, either in the near term, and I'm thinking continuity of operations. How do we keep those businesses that are essential running? And we've noted, and Stephen shared with you some of the challenges that they're facing: supply chain, health safety, all of those things, teleworking, those types of things. And again, to prioritize those resources towards the sectors that have been previously identified as high priority, or those that may be highly impacted locally, and this would be more a part of a recovery thinking response. Go Virginia's traditionally had 4 big investment areas. I think for this program, we're probably going to be seeing a lot of focus in 3: workforce development, anything training, retraining, transitional training, incumbent worker training. The second being cluster scale up, and just the simple way to think about that is, business retention and expansion services in that whole kind of portfolio of things that could be used to help and support existing businesses. And then the last one being the startup ecosystem. And we all know during periods of economic downturn, there can be an incredible increase in entrepreneurial activity in startups. I mean, I've been reading a lot of research about the unicorns that are born out of recessions and the number of Fortune 500 companies that emerged out of recessions. So, we think that making sure there's infrastructure there to support that is going to be important as well. All right, next slide. These are some activities which we've said encouraged, and we've talked to a lot of folks. This is not exhaustive, please, and it's not even particularly instructive. It's examples. Go Virginia has always been about expanding capacity to do a thing. So think about expanding regional capacity to coordinate and deliver business support services, including preparing companies to successfully access financing. Is there an opportunity, and we talked to Robbie Demaria up in Commerce and Trade about, to use crowdsourcing platforms in new and different ways. So that would be a different type of kind of a community-based financing mechanism. We're seeing a lot of companies that have an interest in using the internet for e-commerce to increase sales. Is there a regional strategy that could help a group of companies explore and execute on some of those options? Identifying and connecting suppliers of goods and services. We're hearing a lot of supply chain interruptions because even though the company in your community may be doing well, or the industry, they're having downstream interruptions in the supply chain. And so are there things that could be done to better organize that and potentially engage other Virginia businesses, which I think is kind of an interesting opportunity and strategy as well. Expanding testing capabilities, antibody detection, to encourage safe return to work strategies. When we think about how we turn the economy back on, what are some resources or assets that could be in play in your community that could really help make that happen? Developing new or expanded industry-aligned on-the-job training programs. And I would just like to say, with the Virginia having a work share program, which is a partial unemployment program, what could be done with workers that are either furloughed or doing some other things to continue to keep their skills fresh? Could that be done remotely? Do we need new capacity to do that? projects should not duplicate existing efforts. So I think we've got to remember we don't want to compete with kind of the infrastructure and the programs that are there, including some of the federal programs. This is an opportunity to use Go Virginia to draw down additional federal resources. And so as much as we can look for those types of opportunities. Because the program is going to be, we're looking for relatively near-term impact, or at least the potential to say, looking into the future, we don't want this to happen again. Are there things that we need to build that would make us more resilient and less vulnerable for these types of events? Next slide. Planning only applications. I think we need to limit the amount of planning and have more doing. I'm all about that. I'd rather do the thing and not have it fully conceived than spend your whole grant just planning an activity and never getting to execution. So think about that. Next slide. And this is the one everybody wants to know about, prohibited activities. This is based on precedent for the Go Virginia program. So I just want this out of the gate. Go Virginia is not like a traditional economic development incentive program, meaning it can't provide direct grants to businesses. It cannot provide direct loans to small businesses or large businesses or mid-sized businesses. It cannot capitalize revolving loan funds, and it cannot be used to create seed funds, for example, that might engage an equity investment in a firm. So we just want to kind of put that out there. In terms of roles, we've got DHCD. We administer the program at the state level. We're going to develop the guidelines. We're going to execute the program in the way that the state board and the legislature, even when the program was created, we want to be true to all of those ideas. The regional councils are going to administer the program at the regional level. Their responsibility is really to engage those partners and identify those high impact opportunities and initiatives. They are going to receive applications. So similar to our regular process, they're going to come through those regional councils. Again, we've still got that new fast access process to expedite that. Once those are endorsed by the regional councils, then they'll come to us at DHCD for review, state board review and approval. And you can see, the Go Virginia State Board will evaluate ongoing the performance of the program, whether it needs to be extended, and if we need to change, some of the requirements. Next slide. But I think, I just want to put it out there, one of the most important, I think, roles here is really going to be the economic development community. We've had conversations with a lot of regional councils, and you guys may have had experiences with them. Whether or not they're able to, we've got a couple options. The councils can convene, and they definitely are starting to do outreach. Some are having weekly meetings with their local economic development folks. Some are having weekly meetings with industry leaders in those sectors that they've identified. But I think the economic development community, because you're already doing the outreach, the businesses in your community. We've had some really early conversations where we've got the thing, we want to do it. Let's go. So excited about that. And I just provide, that is not my correct email, Connie. If you share these slides, that's half my personal email and half of my work email. That's where my brain is these days. We want to have the guidelines and the applications, which I'm just going to tell you, the fast access application is going to have 5 questions on it. Okay. And our other application, our regular access application, if you will, is going to look exactly like our application for per capita funds. So it's very, very simple application. We've got templates for budgets. We're going to make all of that available. We are going to get some feedback with our regional council leadership and their support org staff tomorrow during a call. I'm having some conversations with some folks with House and Senate Finance, reviewing those guidelines as well, making sure we don't miss the mark. We hope to have this done by close of business on Wednesday. And that information will be then disseminated at the regional level. And so you guys will be able to kind of see, and if there's been some things that have been happening and you feel like this might be a good match for you, that you can go ahead and reach out to the regional councils as well. That's all I got.
Thank you, Sarah. I don't see any questions in the chat box right now.
Jim, actually, there are several.
Okay.
Lindsay, you want me to read them? Okay, I'll move forward. So Telly Tucker wants to know, can localities purchase PPE from Virginia manufacturers? If so, how? Tracy Bleedo says we're looking into doing a large order from Bedford County to assist our service and industrial companies that can't order them right now because of the rules, but still need them to be safe. Oh, Lindsay's. Okay.
Debbie responded that the Virginia Manufacturers Association said that McClellan Companies in Waynesboro announced that they have access to PPPEs and they're taking orders and their website, and she provided that website.
Great. Everybody should be able to see that in the chat box if they look. That's all I see.
Wonderful. Well, I just said, I think on behalf of, DHCD and I think Matt as well and other members of the team, we are really looking forward to partnering with you and are keenly interested in getting these resources out as quickly as possible. This program, I'll speak to Go Virginia. I know a lot of people are like, just tell me what we can do. Well, as soon as we write the rules, then they're the rules. As long as we keep, our minds open to the possibilities, I'd rather have us kind of write the rules as we go along than start off with, a really strict list of thou shalt nots, because we do want to make this work and we want to be as flexible as possible.
Well, we appreciate that attitude. I think speed trumps everything right now. So
absolutely. Yep.
Look forward to that on Thursday. Any other questions for any of our speakers? I see they're all here still available.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Changed your name, but I see you're there, Stephen.
There are no more questions that I see, Jim.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, I want to thank all of our speakers. Great information today. We do plan to be back again next Monday. And I want to remind everyone that VEDA is sponsoring a peer-to-peer opportunity this Friday at noon for local and regional EDOs. Share your ideas, ask questions of each other. It's a terrific opportunity to share information and learn some things, I hope. Connie, anything else we need to cover before we leave the meeting?
Nope, I'm good. We'll try to get the information out earlier this week for next Monday.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you all very much. Hang in there. This too shall pass. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.